now a wider war happening with what the BBC call Israel's incursion into Lebanon, but declaring war, bombing Lebanon, and now on the brink of what looks like being on the brink of war with Iran. So everything we predicted is happening, and Stop the War has been well placed with other organisations to mobilise opposition to that and bring people out on the street saying that our government's got to rethink its strategy. Why our government think now, having given both governments that we've had in the last year, given a free hand to Israel, think by saying, "Oh, think again," will have any impact. I don't know. So we've got, it is a very serious situation. I think more serious than any some of us can remember for a long time. So it's important that we do come together, we do listen to each other, and we do hear from people who have got an eye on what's going on and can help us, help inform us and help us come to our conclusions. So this is a webinar. We're going to hear from speakers. We're not going to have discussion, but you can put comments in the chat or the Q&A, and some of our speakers may try and pick that up. But we've got a good lineup of speakers today, and as I say, this is going to be the first, I think, of a number of events that certainly Stop the War will be holding, but I know some of the other groups in the coalition will want to do some joint work with us. So without further ado, we've now got nearly 250 people in the room, which is really fantastic and shows the level of concern. I'm going to go to so we're aiming to finish about 7:30, so that you can get on with having a bit of downtime and get ready for the demonstration tomorrow, which I hope everyone will be on. So without further ado, I'm going to go to our first speaker. Taj Ali will be well known to some of you, a historian and a journalist who's been covering what's been happening in Gaza and wider matters for some time, and a good friend of Stop the War. Over to you, Taj.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Stop the War Coalition for organising this event and for organising numerous events over the past 12 months, specifically on Gaza, and before that, campaigning against the Iraq War, campaigning against foreign interventions where we've seen the real impact that has had in the Middle East on the Iraqi people, on the wider region, and of course here at home, where we've seen domestic legislation and an increase in Islamophobia and racism, coupled with foreign policy decisions often used as political tools to serve foreign policy objectives by depicting a terror threat both home and abroad. I think it's really, really important that we recognize that what is happening in Lebanon, what is happening in Syria, what is happening in Yemen, and of course what is happening in Palestine is something that all of us could see coming. Israel is currently run by a government hell-bent on a wider war, and our governments have not taken the action to hold Israel to account. Our governments continue to arm Israel. We had this big announcement about 10% of Britain's arms exports to Israel being suspended. That is simply not good enough. And we will remember how long it took us to push the government into a position to be backing a ceasefire. It took a lot of work. It took a lot of organizing in our communities. And some of you will remember that big vote that we had in the House of Commons, where there were MPs on the fence who were pushed into a position because of the mass movement against what Israel is doing in Gaza. And I think it's important to recognize that the vast majority of the British public oppose what Israel is doing in Gaza. Many people try to depict this as a Muslim issue, as if people of other faiths and other backgrounds do not have any empathy in their hearts for people losing their kids, for the destruction of homes, for the demolition of hospitals, for the killing of innocent civilians. And I think it's been heartwarming to see the mass movement campaigning against what's happening in Palestine. And the British establishment fears that mass movement. When we saw 800,000 people on the streets marching, calling for a ceasefire, there was an attempt to demonize those people. You had the Home Secretary at the time, Suella Braverman, talking about hate marches. And this is why I think it's important to look at the similarities between what was happening during the New Labour years in the run-up to the war with Iraq and the demonization in particular of the Muslim communities to serve that agenda, and what was happening in November, where we saw a 600% increase in Islamophobic attacks. We saw an increase in anti-Palestinian racism. And that was the collateral damage to demonize the call for support for the Palestinian people. And that, of course, enabled people like Nigel Farage to come onto television and talk about how British Muslims don't have British values. And we saw this moral panic develop that Islamists had taken over the country because they feared those people marching on the streets. They feared an increase in politicization of the Muslim community and other minority communities. And people like Tommy Robinson feared it as well. And that's why he wanted the far right out on the streets, because he saw the numbers and the mass movement. And so the events we saw in the summer, the racist riots we saw, have to be understood in that broader context, that there was rhetoric from the top. There was an agenda to demonize Muslims in order to halt that call for a ceasefire, in order to halt that call for Israel to be held to account. And so I think it's important that when we talk about resisting the far right, when we talk about tackling Islamophobia, that we join the struggles and we build a broader mass movement on the streets, and also tackling the hate that we get from politicians and journalists as well. And I think one of the most important victories, I would say, was one of the biggest rebellions under Keir Starmer's leadership during that ceasefire vote. And that was because our communities could mobilize in our big numbers and write to our local MPs and say, if you do not vote for a ceasefire, you will not get our vote. And I think there's been a bit of complacency since the election, because we haven't seen that many MPs coming out and saying we want a full and immediate arms embargo. And so I think it's very important on the back of this meeting that we go into our communities and think about what sorts of groups we can work with, whether it's the local mosques, whether it's community organizations, open letters, e-tools, where we're saying to our politicians that there might not be an election anytime soon, but we will remember your position when it comes to an immediate arms embargo. And that's the position that we need to be pushing at this point. It's actually quite shameful that it took so long for so many of them to back a ceasefire. That was the bare minimum. And in my opinion, an arms embargo is the bare minimum. It's never a radical position. And so I think we have to double down and organize in our communities and say to every member of parliament that if you are not willing to back an immediate full arms embargo, you will not get our vote. I think that is a fair position. I don't think that's particularly radical to say that our government shouldn't be arming Israel to the teeth. And now you look at what's happening in Lebanon at the moment, where we've seen 1 million people displaced. You see what's happening with Iran at the moment, and you see the response from the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, where there's just a complete lack of empathy for the Palestinian people, for the Lebanese. And it is racism. It is about dehumanizing the Arab people. And it's the same racism that leads to what we saw in the summer. There's been a fear for too long in society to call out what Israel is doing. Some people fear being accused, for instance, of anti-Semitism, as if standing for Palestinian rights and tackling anti-Semitism are mutually exclusive. They are not. And it's precisely because we are anti-racist that we condemn the apartheid, the ethnic cleansing, the killing of innocent civilians. And so I think we have to be unapologetic and say Palestine and Lebanon are red lines for our movement. They are just as important as our fight for decent housing and decent wages, because we all want a roof over our heads. We all want money in our pockets. We all want food on our table, but we also want a world that lives in peace. We want to live in peace. We want to get on with our lives. And when we have politicians saber rattling for another war, calling for more militarism, that is a sign that we are headed in the wrong direction. So I would like to see us organizing in our communities. I come from Luton, and we are going to be looking to hold a public meeting where we link the struggle against the far right with the struggle against imperialism. And I think it's important that all of us go back and organize in our communities, continue to build support, come out to the demonstration tomorrow and show the British establishment how many of us oppose what is happening in Gaza right now? How many of us oppose the killing of innocent civilians? And it's so easy for us to become complacent after attending a few demonstrations, or when politicians have done the bare minimum. A ceasefire is not enough. We need a full and immediate arms embargo, and that should be our objective as an organization and as a broader movement. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Taj, for opening up with that. I think it's important, as you said, we note that calling for a ceasefire is common currency now, whereas when we started calling for it, people said, oh, we can't do that. So it's important to recognise that we are pushing forward. And just to say, Stop the War is supporting the demonstration on October the 26th against Tommy Robinson. And I've made the point when speaking that Tommy Robinson is supporting Israel, quite openly, and using his support for Israel to promote Islamophobia, as you've suggested. So thanks for that opening. Sophie, are you okay if we take Ben now? Because I think, Ben, are you on limited time?
I'm all right. I've got a few minutes, but I'm happy to go whenever suits.
Okay, Sophie was going to go next. Were you happy to wait to go after Sophie?
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Okay, so our next speaker, I'm going to introduce straight away then. Sophie Bolt is Vice Chair of CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, who are one of the organisations in the coalition that's been organising the mass demonstrations and the mass campaign against the genocide in Gaza and supporting the demonstration tomorrow. Over to you, Sophie.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Alex. And thanks so much to Stop the War for organising this absolutely critical webinar. And just to say, it's just great to follow Taj. I totally agree with everything you were saying in terms of the whipping up of Islamophobia. So obviously this absolutely terrible escalation that we're seeing in the Middle East is the direct result of the West's military and political backing for Israel. We basically have a genocidal nuclear armed state that basically seems intent on dragging the whole region into a war and now threatening all-out confrontation with Iran. And the scale of the death toll, I think, shows both Israel's military power and also its political impunity. So we know that over 41,000 people have died in Gaza, now over 1,000 in Lebanon, with Israel bombing densely populated residential areas with these US-made 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs, which, are illegal under international law. And we know that Israel is widening its military attacks throughout this time and is trying to draw Iran into conflict. So back in April, after Israel bombed the Iranian consulate in Syria, we all waited absolutely horrified that this would spark all-out war. And nearly 2 weeks later, Iran did retaliate by launching drones and missiles against Israeli military targets. Yet Israel continued to escalate, refusing a ceasefire in Gaza and continuing with its genocide. Simultaneously, there were repeated attacks in the Yemen, including airstrikes on ports on the Red Sea, over 1,000 miles from Israel's borders. And in response to calls from the US, the EU and Britain for a temporary ceasefire, Israel then assassinated Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, just last week. Iran's, many are saying reluctant further retaliation on Monday of 180 ballistic missiles. These again were targeted at military installations in what it described as a proportionate and reasonable response. Netanyahu has now said that Iran has made a big mistake and will pay for it. So Israel's barbaric genocidal land grab and its widening military aggression now threatens an all-out confrontation with Iran. Now, former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak has said that Israel is likely to mount a large-scale airstrike against Iran's oil industry and possibly what he calls a symbolic attack on a military target related to Iran's nuclear program. Now, as well as a nuclear power plant at Bushehr on the Gulf Coast. Iran has nuclear research facilities and other facilities across the country amongst a population of 91 million people. So any targeting of Iran's nuclear facilities, however symbolic, could risk huge civilian casualties, create terrible environmental effects, including, of course, the risk of a radioactive explosion. Now, the US is saying that it doesn't back an attack on Iran's nuclear program. That is good to hear, but given its track record, it shows that its words really, mean nothing. And any attack, as I say, even symbolic, could end attempts to broker a nuclear agreement with Iran and the US. Warmongers are talking about Iran's nuclear program, their attempt to build a nuclear bomb as a ticking bomb that must be dealt with. But of course, they fail to mention that Israel has between 90 and 400 nuclear warheads. We don't know how many, because they totally refuse to be part of any international arms control treaties or allow international weapons inspections. And in fact, Iran has been working in good faith to try and renew a nuclear agreement with the US that includes regular weapons inspections in return for the US dropping economic sanctions. Called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, it was agreed between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council in 2015, and there have been lots of effort to get it to work, despite Trump pulling out on behalf of the US in 2018, and literal sabotage in the form of cyber attacks by Israel during talks taking place in Vienna in 2021. And just last week, before the UN Security Council emergency meeting, Iran again called for a renewal of this joint comprehensive plan of action around its nuclear program. But if Israel escalates its attacks, Iran could well view this as reason to abandon these talks and to develop, a nuclear weapons program and withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So all efforts have to be made to stop Israel's military escalation. We all understand how serious this situation is in terms of what it means for the people of Gaza, who are continually enduring daily bombardment, for the people of Lebanon facing both aerial bombardment and land invasion, for the millions of people living in Iran now threatened with all-out war. We know that such an escalation puts us all on a precipice, with the threat of a widening war, not just across the Middle East, but a world war that could go nuclear. Here in Britain, the peace, anti-war and anti-nuclear movements have a massively important role to play. We know that this government is walking in lockstep with the US and Israel. So we have to keep up the pressure against the British military's, the British government's complicity in genocide, and redouble our efforts for an arms embargo, as has already been said. But also we need to expose the nuclear dangers of this terrifying escalation, both across the Middle East and in Ukraine. We need to mobilize and be confident in the majority support there is for both a ceasefire in Gaza and a negotiated settlement over Ukraine. And of course, we must intensify our coordinated action with states in the global south and the millions across the world who have no choice but to struggle for peace, global justice, and a livable planet. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for that wide-arching assessment of where we're at and the threats that seem more real than they have done for a while in terms of nuclear capacity and the threat of nuclear war. So thanks for that, and good luck for your AGM tomorrow, your CND AGM tomorrow. I'm going to go straight on to our next speaker, who is the director of Palestine Solidarity Campaign, a key organisation in terms of getting together the infrastructure and then putting people on the streets week after week or fortnight after fortnight for the last year. The mass demonstrations we've seen. Welcome to Ben Jamal. And thanks for giving us a bit of your time today.
Thank you, Alex. And listen, thank you to all of our comrades at Stop the War. We have seen so much of each other over the last 12 months that I'm still of the view that it's time we all moved into the same house. But look, I'm here really to deliver one fundamental message for everybody who is able, that we need you to join us once again tomorrow on the streets of London. Tomorrow we expect hundreds of thousands of people to come and march on what is the 20th national march we've organised collectively since Israel launched its genocide upon the people of Gaza. Tomorrow we need hundreds of thousands of people to attend. You all know that next week we are going to be marking 1 year of this genocide, a genocide that's killed at least 42,000 Palestinians. Some of you would have seen the report released in the last few days from a team of US doctors who estimated that the real figure of fatalities in Gaza may be closer to 120,000, 1/5 of Gaza's population, a genocide that has destroyed the societal infrastructure, schools, mosques, hospitals, and universities, displaced over 2 million people, and left the entire population still facing famine. But there is a truth that we have all been asserting since last October, that history did not begin on October the 7th. This is a genocide built upon the foundations of over 70 years of colonization, occupation, and apartheid that continues unabated across all of historic Palestine. This week brought fresh images of Palestinians collecting body parts in bags after Israel bombed a cafe in the West Bank, not in Gaza, in the West Bank, killing 18 people. Now, across this movement for months, we have been warning that allowing Israel impunity for its crimes would not only leave thousands of Palestinians to face further slaughter, but would embolden Israel to provoke a wider conflagration. And as we have heard, and as you all know now, that reality is unfolding with Israel's indiscriminate bombing of Lebanon, which has killed over 1,000, hundreds of them civilians, including children, and its moves to begin a war with Iran. Indeed, in the past few days, Israel, whilst it continues its genocide in Gaza, continues to enforce its brutal occupation in the West Bank, has struck Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and now we are seeing across the political establishment and our media a grotesque open discussion about which parts of Iran's civilian infrastructure, should it be oil refineries, should it be its nuclear program, that Israel should be allowed to target. Not one of us last October thought we would still be marching 1 year later. None of us, never mind our awareness of the impunity the West has granted to Israel for decades, thought that that impunity could extend to greenlighting the live-streamed slaughter of tens of thousands of people. And yet here we are. And still our government arms Israel. Still it ignores the rulings of the world's highest court not to aid and abet a genocide. And still it offers Israel a diplomatic and political shield. There are things that Palestinians and we in the Solidarity movement have known and asserted for decades that in the past 12 months have been laid bare to the world. Laid bare is the raw, naked face of Israel's system of racist oppression and the depths of support for it across Israeli society, manifested again in the past few days as its citizens openly celebrated the continuing carnage in Lebanon and Gaza, dancing and singing in the bars of Tel Aviv. Laid bare is the hypocrisy of Western powers, including our government, and their claims to support a rules-based system rooted in respect for rights and international law, and laid bare is the racism that determines who is deemed to hold rights that deserve protection and who is not. This week we saw Keir Starmer, who has found himself unable even to issue words of condemnation for Israel's genocide and its bombing of Lebanon, rush to the microphone in Downing Street to condemn within hours Iran for its attack on Israel and assert Israel's right to defend itself. Well, we know the truth. No state has the right to defend its practice of genocide, apartheid, and military occupation. It is those who suffer oppression under those systems who have the right to defend themselves and to be defended. I know I cannot be alone this week in hearing the words of Tony Benn delivered in the Commons during the Iraq war debate, echoing down the years with enduring moral clarity. Aren't Arabs terrified when they are bombed? Don't Arab women weep when their children die? So we gather here today with the stench of Keir Starmer's hypocrisy and racism still filling our nostrils. But we also gather here, even in this dark chapter in the Palestinian story, with hope. A hope nourished by our belief that despite Israel's overwhelming military force, the last 12 months will mark a turning point in the struggle for justice. We know that Israel is becoming increasingly isolated, on trial at the world's highest courts, its leaders facing prosecution at the ICC and condemned in a UN resolution passed by over 70% of member states. And even as the powerful Western governments fail to act, their citizens are rallying and winning important boycott and divestment victories. The message is being delivered to corporations around the world. There is no more business as usual with a state enacting the crimes of genocide and apartheid. Companies like G4S, Orange, and Puma have been forced to abandon contracts by boycott campaigns. And some of you would have seen recently the credit agency Moody's has downgraded Israel's rating, warning that it will soon reach junk status. Here in the UK, councils like Walton Forest have got the message and are divesting from arms companies supplying Israel with weapons, and there will be more to follow as we ramp up our divestment campaigns. So we will take the call for boycott and divestment and sanctions to every town and city, to every corner of society. On October the 10th, we want you to join us in the Workplace Day of Action. If you are a trade unionist, please join PSC's Trade Union Conference on October the 19th. But tomorrow, if you care about justice, rights, and peace, there is only one place to be, and that is on the streets of London. We will not be silent. We will not stop until the genocide is ended, until the walls of apartheid come crashing down, until all of the Palestinian people scattered across the world are able to return to their homeland, and on every inch of the land between the river and the sea, in Haifa, in Ramallah, in Jerusalem, and in Gaza, they are finally free. Please join us tomorrow.
Thanks very much, Ben. We just, whilst Ben was speaking, we hit 300 people on the call. So that's 300 people who heard those words from Ben. And when we release the video, share it as wide as you can. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, Ben, at the front of the march. And I do love that phrase Ben just sort of echoed there. Is one of my, really will be a lasting memory of all those demonstrations. We are the people. We will not be silenced. That's the message we've got to get out. We were joined a few minutes ago by our speaker from the Lebanon, Ghassan Abu-Sitah, but we've lost the connection in the last couple of minutes, so we're trying him again. But if it's okay with you, Salma, you've been waiting patiently. We're going to hear from Salma Yaqoob now, who probably needs no introduction, a long-standing activist for peace and against war in this country, and a patron of Stop the War Coalition, currently active in Birmingham. Salma.
Thank you, Alex. It's so important that we are meeting this evening on the eve of the 20th mass mobilization for peace to call out Israeli war crimes. And it's absolutely imperative that we have the numbers on the streets tomorrow, as well as on the 26th of October, when we have a massive Stand Up to Racism mobilization as well. I just want to say a few things. We've had a fantastic analysis already by previous speakers. Today marks the 88th anniversary of the Battle for Cable Street. Anti-racism is not new to this country, as is far-right mobilization. And the antidote is always solidarity. It's always about people coming together. And it's a disgrace that at that time, almost a century ago now, it was the division, the racist hatred, the mobilization against Jewish communities, and we saw what happened in the Second World War. We saw the Holocaust. We saw where racist rhetoric leads. And we said never again. And yet, almost a century later, we're seeing racist rhetoric based on racism, based on dehumanization, based on the idea that all humans are not equal. Because this is what it boils down to. When I think about how is it that now in the age of social media, where nobody can say they don't know, we are seeing a genocide live streamed. We are seeing the mothers weeping. We are seeing literally the baby's limbs torn apart. We're seeing the efforts of medics, of people who themselves have lost family lives, desperately trying to save those lives. We are witnessing a situation where an area the size of Shanghai Airport, 2 million people have been forced to stay there with no toilet facilities, no water, no sanitation, no food being allowed in. Nobody can say they don't know. But why is it that it's still being allowed? And I would say it's about a racism that's been exported around the world, where if you're not white, if you're not British, if you're not American, if you're not Australian, if you're not a New Zealander, your life is expendable. That's what it really boils down to. You know, we saw this week a retaliation from Iran, a very calibrated, even the BBC at times acknowledged it's been a restrained response, where they said very clearly we targeted military installations, not civilians. And we heard words like, this is a barbaric intervention. Yet they could not find the word barbaric when it came to thousands and thousands of children, women and men being murdered. And so we start with Gaza, then Lebanon and Syria, and now the threats to Iran. And the language they use is, this is an opportunity. They are gleeful about it. They're cheering this murder on. And our politicians in the UK have no moral compass. And this again lays bare what's happened now is the unmasking of that face of civility, where they used to claim, they could claim that we uphold a rules-based order. There is no such thing left. If what Israel has done is demonstrate not only its own inhumanity, but those of its backers. And as much as we want to say, you know, how we condemn Israel, the reality is this. Israel could not do this for one single day did it not have the arms supplied by America primarily, as well as Europe and our own UK government included, but the political impunity granted by those very same people who claim to uphold Western civilization. And you'll hear these words, Western civilization. I see it in the Telegraph, I see it in the Daily Mail, with so-called philosophers say how this is a battle of Western civilization against barbarism. And of course, what does that mean? When you pause just for a moment, what that means is they're saying that those Muslims, those Arabs that were being murdered are all barbarians. And their killing is justified, or we can just pretend to have some crocodile tears. We can use words like collateral damage because they are brown, because they are Muslim, because they are Arab. And even Arab Christians then get homogenized into that. So in Bethlehem, we have an occupation, but Christian leaders around the world find it difficult to condemn that because they're brown and they're Arab. And I think it's important that we keep calling out the racism which underlies the justification and the continuation of apartheid and now of absolute genocide. And words are not enough. Words are not enough. Tears are not enough. You know, it's easy to be full of despair full of despair when we see what's happening in front of us. And the thing that keeps me going, brothers and sisters, when I see the resilience of the people on the ground themselves. People have been subjected to this not just since last October, but for decades and decades. And they have a concept called samud, resilience, steadfastness. And we have to just have a minutiae of that to extend our solidarity, because the antidote to all of this, it sounds simple, but it is not simple, is to hold on to the idea that every human life has the same value. Jewish life, Muslim life, Christian life, secular life, whatever your background, whatever colour or creed you have. Such a simple notion, but it is a failure to uphold that which enables these grotesque wars to continue. And for us to come out on the streets tomorrow in London to say not in our name is absolutely vital, because they are now imported that toxic racism into British politics itself. Our politicians are bought, our politicians have been silenced, and they want to silence the rest of us. And we are here to say we are not going to be silenced. They are now attacking our civil rights. We are now seeing people being imprisoned just for expressing an opinion of solidarity. That was not a situation before. Even when, and so many of us here on this call came out when Iraq was being attacked, we did not have a situation where British MPs would be sanctioned for speaking up, where people who came on marches were told what you can and cannot say on a placard, or what you can and cannot say on a platform, where people were risking losing their jobs simply for showing some basic humanity. So we have seen that the politics of apartheid in Israel are now very much being imported here. So a line of resistance, a line has to be drawn here. So in terms of actually now defending our own rights, defending our own democracy right here in the UK, as well as extending that solidarity abroad. And never, ever underestimate the importance of standing up, being counted. We are not powerless. We are not voiceless. They are scared. They are weak in their own way. Israel itself is weak. As I said before, it could not stand for one day were it not for the allyship of our leaders. And that's why we have to hold our leaders to account. Whilst whatever remnants of democracy we have to be out there expressing our dissent, putting that pressure on. Already we've seen, it might not seem massive, but even having 8 to 10% of a weapons embargo on Israel is a massive turning point for British politics, as a sign of their fear that they have to resort to these draconian measures to try and silence people. But here's what the reality is. Despite the propaganda, despite the BBC being another voice piece for Israel in effect, despite the silencing impact, only 17% of British population now say they support Israel in what it's doing. So that's a massive majority of British people, despite the huge efforts of the whole of the mainstream political elite, the whole of the mainstream media that we know is owned literally by a handful of people who are pro-Zionist, that yet the hearts of the people are still touched. And that, for me, is where the hope is, to keep that connection, to keep that solidarity, to keep that focus on what is real and what is not. And so the days ahead are not going to be easy. They have tried to goad Iran into this. Iran has been quite restrained. It's been quite deliberate. And of course, it's been demonized for many, many years. And now it itself faces an existential threat. I mean, this is something that Netanyahu has been very proudly calling for and cheering on. But the only thing that will stop them, and this is sad because we're here on a Stop the War call, we're here joined by Sophie representing CND, where we don't want to see escalation, we don't want to see war, we don't want to see more nuclear weapons. But the logic of what the Western leaders are doing is saying, actually, if you don't have nuclear weapons, if you don't have a credible threat back of violence, then there is nothing to stop us. And so now we're hearing Iranian leaders saying, guys, you've crossed enough red lines, and if you cross one more red line, actually, we will use weapons against Israel. And, you know, we have got weapons that can target oil installations, which will actually threaten Western interests. So the sad reality is this. If that is the only thing now that's going to stop people on the military line, that may well become the logic that people are being forced into. But our job is to say we want a de-escalation, not an escalation. We want peace, not war. And we have to strain every muscle and sinew, every breath in our body to make sure that happens. And nobody can then say that these wars that our so-called leaders are absolutely cheering on, they are not in our name. We stand on the right side of history. We must stand together. We will not be silenced.
Thanks very much, Salma. That was fantastic. Really wise words. And one thing I want to take out is something the Palestinians we visit in the West Bank, the NEU sends delegations to the West Bank. We're not going at the moment, obviously, but one of the things they say to our delegations is we don't want your tears. We're not interested in your tears. It's your voices we want. And people always come back from there determined to raise the voice in support of Palestine. So thank you very much for being here tonight, and thanks for being patient with us. That was great. So our next speaker, I'm really pleased that he's able to join us. We lost the connection for a bit. So thanks for being patient with us, Ghassan. Ghassan Abu-Sitah is a Palestinian doctor. He's currently in Lebanon. I was recently elected as rector of Glasgow University. So we're really pleased you can be with us tonight, Ghassan, and look forward to hearing what you've got to tell us.
Thank you very much, and yes, thank you for bearing with me. So basically, what is happening now in Lebanon is that we are watching what we now refer to as the Gaza template unfolding in Lebanon. And by the Gaza template, I mean that there are now things that are intrinsic to Israel's military strategy in the region, that it has tried out successfully in Gaza, that now it wants to use in Lebanon. And central to that template is the idea of ethnic cleansing. So Israel tried to ethnically cleanse Gaza, and when it couldn't achieve that, it reverted to genocide. And in South Lebanon, it has ethnically cleansed South Lebanon, forcing 1 million people to become internally displaced in Lebanon, which is a record even by Lebanon's difficult history. Never has this happened in 1982 Israeli invasion, or in the 2006 Israeli war, or even in the civil war, that 1 million Lebanese, Syrians and Palestinians living in Lebanon have become internally displaced. The other phenomena that we're watching from the Gaza template is the centrality of the destruction of the health system to the conduct of war, to military strategy. Over 100 health workers have been killed so far in this war. Israel has been systematically targeting all ambulances and field hospitals in the south, and also has been using a tactic that it uses and has used and continues to use a lot in Gaza, where it bombs buildings right adjacent to a hospital with a bomb huge enough to damage the hospital. And this has meant that so far, 5 hospitals in Lebanon have had to be evacuated. 3 in Beirut and 2 in the south. And the bombing of people's homes, the complete disregard to human life. Israel, in passing, said that during the assassination of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, it killed over 300 Lebanese civilians, and admits that. So the number must be much more when it dropped 85 2,000-pound bombs on a neighborhood in the southern suburbs of Beirut. And it has killed now over 160 children. And again, in the hospitals of Beirut, I'm treating kids with blast injury to the face, with amputated limbs, whole families wounded, whole families wiped out. And so again, we see this idea that Gaza became a template in which Israel's wars will be modeled. And it is apparent that what Israel and Western imperialism want is for Israel to get rid of Palestinians living in Palestine, and then ethnically cleanse an area of scorched earth that surrounds historical Palestine. So at least 10 to 15 kilometers in South Lebanon, so that Israel is able to control the region and resume its role as the policeman for Western imperialism. What I continue to remind people in Lebanon and whomever I speak to is that we need to understand that the bombs that are killing children and civilians in Lebanon at the moment were delivered to Israel during the Gaza genocide over the last year. And so it is obvious that that war and Western support for that genocide extended beyond just what was happening in Gaza, or even just what was happening in the West Bank, but actually into Israel's attempts to have a regional war. And so now the second chapter of Israel's regional ambitions of an endless war has started. And it unfortunately looks like it will be as prolonged and as brutal as the war in Gaza. While the war in Gaza now continues, with the added benefit of the fact that it's no longer in the news. So yesterday, Israel killed over 100 Palestinian civilians. That barely made it into any of the news news agencies. And Israel, a few weeks ago, delivered the body of a Palestinian doctor that it had imprisoned and tortured to death. And so Israel continues its genocidal project in Gaza, but now, having set up the genocidal killing machines in Gaza, it's able to divert its army to the north. And by these genocidal killing machines, I mean the famine that continues to take Palestinian lives, the destruction of the health system that has led to a public health catastrophe and these infectious diseases that continue to take people's lives, and the destruction of the health system, which means that the wounded eventually are now succumbing to their wounds and dying. And all of this is able to continue with Israel diverting the majority of its armed forces, or at least its land forces, to conduct this new war in South Lebanon. And those of us who are old enough to remember, this is exactly what South Africa used to do, with wars simultaneously in Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, all in defense of the indefensible. The problem that exists for us as British citizens is that it is our money and it is our government, and there's growing evidence that it's even armed forces and security services that are contributing to these wars. And so it's critical, it is absolutely critical that people make their voices heard in the streets. That is the only way we are able, as British citizens, first to absolve ourselves from the historical, moral duplicity of this genocide and these genocidal wars, by at least saying no, not in my name, but to ensure that at least the victims are able to see human beings on the other side of the world that restore their faith in humanity, rather than serve to further deepen the concept that the right and the neoconservatives hold, that this is all a clash of civilizations. So I call on everybody, for your own salvation, for your own moral salvation, you need to come out into the streets tomorrow. You need to basically say what is being done to children, to women, to men, to civilians in Gaza, in Lebanon, in West Bank, in the refugee camps of the West Bank, is not in your name. And that these duplicitous, imperialist, ruling elites that govern the UK are doing this despite our obvious objection, despite the results in the general elections that showed the depth of emotion in the UK. So please come out tomorrow, regardless of how tiring it is to still be out in the street. It is not as tiring as trying to survive in Gaza. It is not as tiring as sleeping on the Coronation Beirut with your family because you're one of a million who've been displaced from southern Lebanon. Come out, make your voice heard, and absolve yourself from a crime. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ghassan, and thank you for joining us. I think some of us wouldn't know what to do on a Saturday if there wasn't an event about Palestine at the moment. Sadly, it's become the feature of our lives, I think. And thanks for joining us today and being patient, and best wishes to you and your family and your colleagues in Lebanon in the coming weeks. Thank you very much for that. So we're coming to the end of our meeting. We've got one more panelist to hear from, and then a video message from Jeremy Corbyn to finish off with. So our final panelist tonight, we've still got just about 300 people on the call, which is great. Our final speaker is John Rees, who is a founder member of the Stop the War Coalition, founded in 2001 in Friends Meeting House in London, and a journalist for Middle East Eye. Welcome, John. Look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks to everybody who's attended tonight. There's a scene in the Christopher Nolan Batman film, The Dark Knight, in which Heath Ledger, playing the Joker, destroys a hospital. It's a really chilling scene for anybody who watches the movie for the first time. And it's chilling on a wholly different level to think that that has been happening many times a day, every week, every month, for a year now in Gaza, and is beginning to happen now, has begun to happen now in the Lebanon. And it's tempting when you see that level of destruction, when you see so many people suffering, so many dead. It's tempting to see the Israeli regime as a kind of state personification of Heath Ledger's portrayal of the Joker, of somebody who is truly criminally, brutally insane. But I want to suggest to you tonight that although that emotion runs very strongly when we see the scenes coming to us from the Middle East, we need to step back and think as clearly as we possibly can about what is happening, because it's only on that basis that we can decide what to do about it. So I want to make just 2 points. One is, if you like, analytical, and the other is tactical. The analytical point is this, that Israel is now conducting military operations in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria, against the Houthis in the Yemen, and is in all likelihood going to commence them now against the state of Iran. And the only conceivable way in which it can do that is that it has the backing of the most powerful imperial countries in the world. Nothing else could equip it with the military apparatus to do that. Nothing else could allow it to have the degree of political and diplomatic support that would allow it to do that. Israel is, of course, the biggest recipient of US military aid in the world. It's the biggest recipient of US civilian aid in the world. It is the only country in the world that can order armaments directly from US arms factories without having to go through the Department of Defense. It is the only state in the world that can use US military aid to buy arms from other countries. Now, that really is a special relationship. Keir Starmer may think that he has one with the Americans, but Israel is the really special relationship. And the Americans don't do that simply because they share Zionist beliefs, simply because they want to hold Palestinians down. And Israel does not act as it does simply to hold Palestinians down. Israel is the watchdog for the Middle East, for American imperialism, the whole of the Middle East. The Arab populations of the region are the main and expansive target of Israeli power. Joe Biden said, it's the best £3 billion we ever spend. If Israel didn't exist, we would have to invent it. And I say that because it's important to look at the imperial architecture of the Middle East. It is composed certainly of support for the state of Israel, but it is also composed of support for the Arab dictators throughout the region. Israel may be the biggest recipient of US military aid, but the El-Sisi dictatorship in Egypt is the second biggest recipient of US military aid. Israel is paid by the imperial powers to keep the Palestinians and by extension the whole of the Arab world down, and the Arab dictators are paid not to attack Israel. And that is precisely the role that the Egyptian regime, the Saudi regime, the Jordanian regime have played in the last year. The major threat to American power and Western power in the Middle East has been, since the 1979 revolution, the state of Iran, and that is why the Americans are willing to see the Israelis extend the war to attack what they describe as proxies, more neutrally we might say allies of Iran throughout the Middle East, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in the Yemen, who, by the way, are conducting a extremely effective blockade of the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. So that is what is driving this war. It is not simply the Zionist ideology of Israel, although it certainly has that, and that is certainly what it uses to justify to its domestic audience its behavior. But it isn't the reason. Ideology is important. You know, if we want to know what happened in the Second World War, of course, Nazi ideology is important. It framed and it guided the Nazis in their actions, but it wasn't the reason. The reason was a deeper imperial conflict involving the Western powers. So I think it's important to think through that because it points us in the right direction about what we can do. If it's because of the United States and the United Kingdom's government, then they are strategically important objectives for political protest. They are part of disabling the Israeli state. They are the thing that we can do something about. We can't do much directly about the IDF, but we can do something about the British government. In fact, we are the only people that are able to do that. No Palestinian, no Lebanese, no Yemeni can deal with the British government in the way that we can. So that's the analytical point. The tactical point is this. After a year, and after watching this unfold and accelerate in recent weeks, of course, there is a debate in the movement about what we can most effectively do. And the point I first want to make is that there's a discussion about direct action, and quite rightly, but only very foolish people counterpose direct action and mass protest. They are two sides of the same coin. They are legitimate forms of protest, and we should support people engaged in both. We certainly should not get into an argument about which is morally superior. That would be a ridiculous and disabling discussion. But we should hold firm to the idea that the mass demonstrations are the great engine at the middle of the Palestinian solidarity movement. They drive the BDS campaign. They drove the electoral victories for the Palestinian candidates, quite taking the establishment by surprise. They defended the right to protest. They are the reason why we can still chant from the river to the sea on British streets in a way that they cannot, for instance, in Germany. They are the engine that produced the changes in policy, limited though they are, that the British government has already undertaken. It is not nothing. It is not enough, but it is not nothing that 30 arms licenses were revoked for Israeli armaments. It would have taken a long time to get 30 arms contracts cancelled simply factory by factory. And they were able to do that because they centre on political power. It is the government policy and government decisions which are at the heart of the pro-Israeli policy, and it's to government and by pressurising government that substantial change will come. So the last thing that we should think is that the demonstrations have run their course, that they couldn't be any bigger because they could, that they have ceased to be effective. Nobody, by the way, in the Middle East takes that view. I have friends in Cairo. I see the press releases, indeed, by the resistance movements in the Middle East, and they refer to the demonstrations in London specifically because they are the biggest in the Western world and have been some of the most effective. It is the business of the mainstream press and of government spokespeople to convince you that marching won't change anything. But it already has, and it will continue to do so if we are strong enough and mobilised broadly enough. One thing that we can do to deepen the movement is to take it into the trade unions. Only the trade unions are bigger than the Palestine Solidarity Movement. Still, 7 million people in trade unions, the biggest voluntary organisations in the country. No fishing club, no hobby has got that many organised members. And through the trade union work, we've now begun to make real inroads. So Unison now talking about mobilising and putting its money where its mouth is in terms of popularising the next workplace day of action. That would add significant weight. If we build on that strand, that will add significant weight to the already huge social movement that we have. So don't lose heart. The people in the Middle East cannot lose heart and cannot stop fighting. We should not stop fighting either.
Thanks very much, John, for that message. Important message that we have already and continue to shift the dial on public opinion and political discourse with our demonstrations. And obviously, it's important that the Palestinians in Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza see us continue to do that. Thanks for that. And thanks for mentioning one of my favourite films, The Dark Knight. I might go off and have a look at